The first thing Dr. Mara Voss noticed when she stepped off the transit shuttle and onto the Vethkali Grand Academy's arrival platform was that the air smelled wrong. Not bad exactly. It was clean, almost sterile, but it had no memory. No petrichor, no exhaust, no bread from a bakery 3 streets over. It was the smell of a place that had never needed to apologize for itself. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, the one with the fraying shoulder seam she kept meaning to replace, and watched the other arrivals filter past her. Tall figures with iridescent dermis layers, scholars in layered academic robes that shifted color at the hem when they moved. A delegation from the Surrey cluster walked in perfect single file, their elongated craniums bobbing gently with each stride. 2 Fenrathi debated something in their layered, harmonic language. 2 voices per body, one high and one deep, weaving together like a fugue. Nobody looked at Myra. She was the only human. She'd known that going in, of course. The letter of appointment from the Academy's Genomics and Evolutionary Biology Department had made it abundantly clear. Dr. Mara Voss, representing the Terran Collective's first formal contribution to Vethkali academic research, would hold a visiting researcher position for 1 standard galactic year. She would have access to the Academy's specimen archives, the B-grade sequencing equipment in Lab Wing 7, and shared use of the Commons. She would not have voting rights in faculty meetings. She would not have a permanent office. She had laughed at that last line. She'd been living out of a 2-room flat in Bonn for 6 years doing postdoctoral work on epigenetic stress markers in isolated populations. The idea of a permanent office felt as distant as orbit. The campus orientation drone, a small hovering sphere with a calm synthetic voice, led her to her quarters in Block K residential wing for visiting non-faculty. The room was 60 square meters. By galactic standards, it was generous. By Mara's standards, having lived in 38 square meters for the last 4 years, it felt almost embarrassing in its space. She set her bag on the narrow bed and stood at the window looking out over the Academy's central plaza, where a fountain of something luminescent cycled through slow arcs in the artificial light. She was here because of something she'd found in a dataset that she wasn't supposed to be looking at. She was here because the finding had scared her, and because scaring Mara Voss took a very specific kind of discovery. And she was here because the Vethkali Grand Academy had, after 18 months of review and 17 layers of institutional vetting, decided they wanted to scare themselves too. The B-grade sequencing lab in Wing 7 smelled exactly as she expected: ozone and machine lubricant and the faint sugary note of chemical fixatives. It was also smaller than she'd been told. 4 workstations instead of 6, 2 of which had hardware under maintenance covers. The terminal allocation system gave her workstation 3, which had a slightly warped scan bed and a processing core that ran warm on the left side. She set up her materials and went to work. The dataset she'd found legally, she needed to be precise about this, she'd found it legally, was a batch-processed anonymized genomics archive from a 2180s Terran population health survey. Standard stuff, or it should have been. What she'd noticed was a cascade signature in a cluster of regulatory gene sequences that didn't behave the way any known terrestrial evolutionary model predicted. The sequences weren't coding for anything obvious. They weren't broken. They were, as best she could determine, waiting. Primed in a way that had no clear environmental trigger and no apparent selective advantage. 7 years of follow-up work had not changed that conclusion. It had only deepened it. The Vethkali peer review process had called the finding suggestive but unconfirmed. 3 Fenrathi reviewers had called it improbable given what is known about Terran evolutionary rate. 1 reviewer she'd never learned who had written a single-line comment: "If this holds, we have a significant problem." She'd framed that comment and hung it above her workstation in Bonn. In the Academy's Wing 7, she had no wall space to hang things, so she kept it in her head. The first month was quiet. She ran sequencing passes, cross-referenced against the Academy's Galactic Evolutionary Database, which was 10 times larger than anything available to Terran researchers, a fact that made her simultaneously grateful and quietly furious, and began building a proper statistical framework for her analysis. She attended 2 department seminars and asked questions that she noticed caused a particular kind of pause in the room, not the pause of confusion, the pause of people recalibrating. She ate alone in the Commons most evenings. The food was fine, some of it was excellent. She learned to request the preparation closest to what the drone menu called thermally processed complex carbohydrates, because it reminded her of pasta, which she missed with a ferocity that embarrassed her given the circumstances. She called her mother on Sundays. Her mother, who ran a bakery in a small town in Wurtemberg and who had a deep suspicion of anything that had happened since the invention of the mobile phone, consistently asked whether she was eating enough and whether the aliens were being respectful. Mara consistently said yes to both, which was mostly true. The second month was when things started to get complicated. It began with a scan. She had requisitioned a full-spectrum genomic scan of her own DNA, standard practice for establishing a baseline control set when a human researcher was the only representative of their species at a facility. The Academy's ethics board had cleared it in 48 hours. She'd run the scan herself at Workstation 3, uploaded the raw data to the shared research partition, and thought nothing more of it. She thought nothing of it for 4 days. On the 5th day, she arrived at Lab Wing 7 to find the door locked. Not maintenance locked, not access restricted for innovation locked. Locked in the specific way that institutional spaces get locked when someone has made a decision and hasn't told you about it yet. She went to the department administrator, a tall Vethkali named Coordicthies, whose facial ridge coloring shifted in patterns that Mara had been told, by the orientation materials, indicated professional neutrality. Coordicthies told her the lab access was under temporary review. Coordicthies told her this while not quite looking directly at her. Mara had worked in enough academic departments to know what that meant. Something had happened, and someone was figuring out who was going to explain it to her. She waited 2 days. Nobody explained anything. On the 3rd day, she filed a formal access inquiry through the Academy's Research Administration portal. The portal acknowledged her inquiry and assigned it a case number. The case number did nothing. On the 5th day, she knocked on the door of Professor Veltherak, the department chair, whose office occupied an entire corner of the building's 4th floor and whose research reputation in xenogenomics was, by any measure, extraordinary. The professor's administrative assistant, a Fenrathi who managed both of its voices with the practiced precision of someone who had been filtering unwanted visitors for a long time, informed Mara that the professor was occupied. Mara asked when the professor might be less occupied. The assistant said it would pass along her inquiry. She walked back to her quarters in Block K, sat on the narrow bed, and looked out the window at the luminescent fountain. She had been here before. Not here, not 70 light-years from home in an alien university, but here in the specific sense of being a junior researcher with an inconvenient finding in a department where inconvenient findings made the senior people nervous. She had been here before, and she knew what it felt like, and she knew what to do about it. She called her mother. Her mother asked about the food. Then Mara opened her personal terminal, connected to the research partition through her standing authorization, which had not, she noted, been revoked, and pulled up the raw scan data. Someone had flagged it, not redacted, not deleted, flagged. The flag code was an internal Academy marker she'd had to look up, Category 7. The category description read, "Data of potential systemic significance requiring multi-department review before dissemination." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she started reading her own genome very carefully. What she found took her 3 nights to confirm. She sat at her personal terminal in Block K with the raw scan data and the Academy's public access version of the Galactic Evolutionary Database, which was smaller than the research partition version but still enormous, and she ran comparisons. She drank terrible instant coffee and ate crackers she'd brought from Earth and wore her oldest sweater, the green one with the hole in the left elbow, because it was the piece of clothing she associated most strongly with doing serious work. What she found was this: the cascade signatures she'd identified in the population health dataset 7 years ago were not, as she had initially hypothesized, a localized anomaly in a subpopulation. They were present in her own genome. They were present in the sampled data she'd included in her original paper from every available terrestrial population. They were, based on what she could extrapolate using the database's records of previous first contact genomic surveys, entirely absent in every other sequence species in the known galactic catalog. Something had happened to human DNA. Something recent in evolutionary terms, meaning somewhere in the last few 100,000 years, and something deliberate was the wrong word, because evolution had no deliberation in it, but something purposeful looking. The cascade sequences appeared to be a set of nested conditional programs. They weren't just waiting. They were waiting for something specific. And based on the expression patterns she could trace in her own data, some of them had already started activating. She sat back and looked at the ceiling of her room in Block K. She thought about what a galactic academy full of species who had been the dominant intelligences for millions of years would feel when they saw this. She thought about the locked lab. She thought about the Category 7 flag. She thought, oh, I see. They weren't keeping her out of the lab to protect proprietary research or manage an administrative backlog. They were keeping her out because her scanned data had caused something to happen in this department, and they were trying to figure out how to handle her. Which meant, she thought very clearly, that she needed to get back into that lab. She got back in on a Tuesday. This required 3 things: her original access clearance, which had never technically been revoked, a maintenance request submitted through the facility's portal citing equipment calibration needs on Workstation 3's thermal issues, which was genuinely a real maintenance problem and which gave her a legitimate reason to be in the space, and the simple fact that institutional bureaucracies, regardless of species, tended to move more slowly than a determined individual with a specific goal. The lab was empty when she arrived. She ran the calibration on Workstation 3's heating element, which took 11 minutes. While the calibration ran, she used her standing researcher credentials to pull the access log for the shared data partition. 41 individuals had accessed her scanned data in the 5 days since she'd uploaded it. 41. The department had 12 faculty members. She recognized 3 names from other departments. She recognized 1 name from the Academy's Administrative Council. She recognized, because she had done her homework before arriving and had spent 7 years tracking citations on xenogenomics research, 2 names from the Fenrathy Institute and 1 name from the S-Surrey Cluster's Academic Liaison Office. 41 people had looked at her genome in 5 days without telling her about it. She copied the access log to her personal terminal and sat for a moment at the warmed workstation with the gentle hum of the processing core and the smell of ozone around her. Her hands were very still. She was a person who got very still when she was angry, which was something most people who had worked with her had eventually learned to find alarming. She thought about what her options were. She could file a formal complaint. The Academy's Research Ethics Charter had provisions about unauthorized access to personal genomic data, and 41 people accessing her data without her knowledge was, by any reading, a violation. The complaint process would take months. During those months, whatever was happening in this department would continue happening without her. She could go public, upload the raw data and her preliminary analysis to the open-access xenogenomics preprint server, where it would be visible to every researcher in the catalog. The Category 7 flag was an internal designation. It had no binding authority over what she chose to do with her own biological data. She was a Terran citizen operating under Terran research protocols on a visiting basis. The Academy's internal flags were not her flags. She thought about this option for a long time. She thought about the 41 names. She thought about what it meant that the Surrey cluster's academic liaison had looked at her genomic data before her own department chair had bothered to speak to her. She thought about the specific texture of being someone whose data was urgently important and whose person was considered manageable. She had felt that texture before. It was familiar. She didn't like it. She made a decision. She submitted the formal complaint through the ethics portal because she was a person who believed in institutional processes even when they were slow. She assigned it a secondary case number and filed it. Then she went back to her room in Block K and spent the next 6 hours writing the most careful, most thoroughly cited, most rigorously structured scientific analysis she had ever produced in her career. Professor Velthorak summoned her on a Wednesday. The professor's office was everything that Mara's workspace in Wing 7 was not. Spacious, warm-lit, lined with display cases of specimen samples from species across 4 galactic arms. Velthorak was a large being, bilateral symmetry, 4 upper limbs in a folded resting position, facial structures that conveyed gravitas in a way that Mara suspected had been cultivated over decades of academic authority. The professor sat across from her at a desk that was wider than Mara's entire workstation, and looked at her with the particular expression of a senior academic who has decided to be candid, because all the other options have become inconvenient. "We owe you an explanation," the professor said. The translation system rendered the words in clean, flat Terran standard. "The access to your data was not sanctioned. I have spoken to the individuals concerned." "I appreciate that," Mara said. She had her notes on her personal terminal, which was open on her lap. "I'd like to understand what they found." "What they found," Velthorak said, "is what you found or near enough. The concern is in the implications." "Which implications specifically?" The professor was quiet for a moment. One of the upper limbs moved slightly, a gesture Mara had come to associate with careful word selection in Vethkali academic culture. "The cascade sequences in your genome, in Terran genomes generally, based on your original dataset, represent a developmental architecture that has no parallel in any cataloged species. We have been studying evolutionary biology for approximately 400,000 of your years. We have sequenced over 8,000 species. We have models for every adaptive pathway that has ever led to sapient emergence. What we see in your data does not fit any of those models." "I know," Mara said. "What it fits," the professor said, "is a class of theoretical architecture that a small number of our own theorists have proposed as a possible accelerated emergence framework. Something that could, under specific environmental pressures, allow a species to develop new cognitive and biological capabilities at a rate several orders of magnitude faster than standard evolutionary processes." Mara had suspected this. The confirmation still sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. "How much faster?" she asked. "Our models," the professor said carefully, "suggest that a species carrying this architecture, under sufficient environmental pressure, might develop in 3 generations what would take another species 3 million years." The room was very quiet. "That's why you flagged the data," Mara said. "That's why 41 people looked at my genome without asking me." "Yes." "Because if it's real," she said, "then we're not what anyone thought we were." Velthorak's facial structures rearranged in a way that Mara was not entirely certain how to interpret, but which felt, in its depth and its seriousness, like something close to respect. "No," the professor said, "you are not." She expected things to get easier after that conversation. They did not. The department did not restrict her data access again. The formal complaint she'd filed was acknowledged and resolved within the week, a speed that told her the academic council was paying close attention. Her lab access was restored. Professor Veltherak began including her in weekly department meetings. All of this was fine. All of this was good, even. What was not good was what started happening in the corridors. She noticed it first as a subtle thing, the specific way that conversation in a common space changed register when she entered it. Not silence exactly, nobody was rude to her. The Academy's standards on interspecies collegiality were rigorous and generally observed, but a shift, a recalibration, eyes that tracked her longer than necessary. A particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with academic courtesy, and everything to do with a species reassessing what it was looking at. One of the junior researchers in the department, a young Vethkali named Sek Torval who was doing dissertation work on epigenetic variation in long-lived species, stopped her in the corridor one morning and asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, whether she found the gravity here comfortable. Mara said yes, it was close enough to Earth standard. Sek Torval nodded and then said, as if the question had been sitting there all along, "Is it true that your people began surviving environments that should have killed you within 3 generations of first exposure?" Mara thought about the data. "In some cases, yes," she said. "There's good documentation of it. Immune system adaptations, metabolic adjustments, things that our models said should take much longer." Sek Torval was quiet for a moment. 3 generations, the young researcher said softly and walked away. 2 days later, a formal request came from the Department of Cognitive Architecture, a department Mara had no affiliation with, asking to include her genomic scan in a comparative study. The request was politely worded and technically within the scope of her original research permissions. She replied that she would consider it, which meant she went and looked up the Department of Cognitive Architecture's recent publication record and spent an uncomfortable afternoon reading about theoretical models of adversarial species assessment. She added that to her increasingly detailed mental map of what was happening here. A Fenrathi faculty member she'd never spoken to appeared at her workstation one afternoon and stood at what she was fairly certain was the maximum polite distance for that species, which was still closer than Mara preferred for someone she didn't know, and asked whether she had relatives who had served in the Terran Defense Force during the Kepler expansion. Mara said yes, her grandmother had. The Fenrathi said nothing, produced a small data chip, placed it at the edge of her workstation, and left without explanation. She picked up the chip and put it in her pocket. She did not plug it in. At the end of the month, she called her mother. Her mother asked how the food was. Mara told her the thermally processed complex carbohydrates were very good. Her mother said she was glad. Then her mother said, in the quiet way that she sometimes said things she'd been thinking about for a long time, "You sound tired, Mara. Not the good tired, the other one." "I'm okay," Mara said. The walls closing in. She looked at the window of her room in Block K, at the fountain out in the plaza, and at the dark beyond the Academy's lights where the stars were. "A little," she said, "but I'm okay." She had not anticipated the data chip. She found it a week later, turning out her jacket pocket for her access card, and remembered the Fenrathi who had appeared at her workstation and placed it there without a word. She'd put it in her pocket and left it there, which was not a decision exactly, more of an instinct, the kind of thing she did when she wasn't ready to know something yet. She held it in her hand for a long moment. It was about the size of a human thumbnail, matte black, featureless. Standard galactic format data storage, compatible with any terminal. She plugged it into her personal terminal. The chip contained a single document. No header, no institutional identifier, no author name. 12 pages of dense text in what the translator identified as a formal Fenrathi academic register, the kind of language used for findings that were still classified. She read it in her room in Block K, slowly, going back over passages 2 and 3 times, because her translated Galactic Standard vocabulary was good, but some of the technical terminology required her to look things up. What the document contained was a xenogenomic study conducted roughly 30 years prior by a joint Fenrathi-Vethkali research team operating under what appeared to be a government-level non-disclosure agreement. The study had been triggered by anomalous results in a routine first-contact biological survey of the Terran system, the kind of sweep that established species ran on newly discovered sapient worlds, cataloging biological diversity and assessing any potential biosecurity concerns. The survey had flagged something. Not something dangerous. Nothing that required quarantine or intervention. What it had flagged was a set of genomic signatures in the human population that the survey instruments had not previously encountered, and which, after extended analysis, the research team had been unable to classify. The document described 3 years of follow-up work, conducted entirely without the knowledge of the Terran collective, because the team had been operating under a protocol that barred disclosure of genomic survey results to the surveyed species until those results were fully understood. And the results had not been fully understood, so the disclosure had never happened. And then the document ended. No conclusion section, no recommendations. Just the 30-year-old data, a list of the research team members all pseudonymized, and a single handwritten equivalent annotation at the bottom, which the translator rendered as, "We did not know what to do with this. We still do not. Someone else should look at it now." She sat for a long time after she finished reading. She thought about what it meant that a Fenrathi she had never met had quietly placed this document in her pocket without a word, which was to say, without plausible deniability, without an institutional paper trail, without anything except the gesture itself. She thought about what it meant that someone 30 years ago had found something in her species' genome that they didn't know what to do with, and had filed it, and had let it sit, and had apparently been thinking about it for 30 years. She thought about the cascade signatures. She thought about the Category 7 flag. She thought about the 41 names. She thought about the specific feeling of a wall that has been close for a long time beginning, very slowly, to develop a door. She saved the document to an encrypted folder on her personal terminal and sat with her coffee going cold in her hand. Then she picked up her terminal and began drafting a message to the Vethkali Administrative Council's ethics office. She would not name the Fenrathi. She would not reveal how she had obtained the document. She would describe it in terms of a finding that had come to her attention through an informal academic channel, and she would note that it predated her own research by 3 decades, and that its existence changed the nature of any institutional claim that her findings were novel or unforeseeable. She finished the message and held her finger over the send button for a few seconds. She sent it. Then she closed the terminal, looked out at the fountain, and started thinking about the preprint. The preprint went live at 3 in the morning, Terran Standard. She'd spent 2 weeks on it, working in her room in Block K after the labs closed, on her personal terminal, with the green sweater and the instant coffee. She had been meticulous. She had been thorough. She had cross-referenced every comparison against 3 separate data sources. She had written the implications section 4 times, tearing it apart each time because the implications were so large that every version felt either too cautious to be honest or too bold to be defensible. The 4th version struck what she thought was the right balance, which was to say, it said exactly what the data showed, no more, in language a graduate student in any biological field could follow, and let the findings make their own case. She titled it, evidence for latent accelerated developmental architecture in Homo sapiens, preliminary analysis of cascade sequence distribution across Terran populations. She included her own genomic scan as a data supplement, fully annotated, with every flag and every access log from the shared partition included as an appendix. She included the access log not out of spite. She had thought very carefully about that, but because the pattern of who had accessed the data and when was itself scientifically significant. It demonstrated institutional recognition of the finding before any formal acknowledgement had been made. She clicked submit at 3:07 a.m. Then she sat in her room and waited to see what would happen. At 3:52 a.m., she had 11 notification alerts. At 5:30 a.m., 43. At 7:00 a.m., when she went to the Commons for coffee, the Vethkali researcher she sometimes nodded to across the room did not nod back. He was reading something on his terminal with the fixed expression of a person who has just learned something that requires him to rethink a prior assumption about the world. At 8:15 a.m., she received a message from the Academy's Administrative Council requesting her presence at a meeting at noon. The message used the phrase urgent consultation. She had expected something like this. She wrote back confirming her attendance, ate her breakfast, and went a wing 7 to check on her equipment. At 9:40 a.m., the preprint had been shared to 47 research networks across 3 galactic clusters. At 11:00 a.m., she received a message from a researcher at the Surrey Institute for Advanced Biological Studies, not the liaison who had accessed her data without permission, a different name, asking whether she was available for a collaborative discussion. The message was 14 paragraphs long and carefully, professionally phrased, and radiated the specific energy of someone who was very smart, very unsettled, and trying to be very composed about both things simultaneously. She wrote back that she'd be happy to connect after her noon meeting. She put on her good jacket, the dark gray one she'd bought specifically for things that required a good jacket, and walked to the administrative wing. There were 9 people in the meeting room. She recognized 4 of them from the access log. Professor Veltharak was there, which she'd expected. The chair of the Administrative Council, a Vethkali whose name she'd seen on official communications, was there. There were 2 members of what the Academy called its External Relations Office, and there were 3 individuals whose institutional affiliations were not, when she looked at the names on the table plaques, any unit of the Academy she'd previously heard of. She sat down, she put her terminal on the table, she folded her hands. Dr. Voss, the council chair began, we appreciate your attendance. I want to address first the matter of the preprint. It's already live, she said. It's been accessed by 47 networks as of this morning. I assume more since I left my room. We're aware. Good. She looked around the table. I want to also be clear that the preprint includes, as a fully documented appendix, the access log from the shared research partition. So anyone reading it will know that the data was accessed by a significant number of individuals prior to any formal review process or any communication with me. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. That, said one of the individuals whose affiliation she hadn't recognized, was not a small decision. No, Mara agreed, it wasn't. You understood the implications. I understand, she said precisely, that my data is my data. I understand that my genome is my genome. And I understand that 41 individuals at this institution decided to evaluate findings about my species without consulting a single member of my species about what those findings meant. She paused. I'm a scientist. I believe in the process. I also believe that the process requires honesty, and honesty required that the people who are going to read this paper know the full picture of how the data was handled. Veltharak, across the table, had a particular quality of stillness that Mara had come to recognize as something other than neutrality. It looked, she thought, like someone who had decided to find out what a human was made of and was in the process of learning. The external relations representative cleared her throat. "What do you want, Dr. Voss?" Mara thought about this. She thought about the locked lab. She thought about the 41 names. She thought about Sec Torval in the corridor saying 3 generations with that particular softness. She thought about the Fenrathi with the unexplained data chip. She thought about her grandmother who had fixed communications arrays on a station in the asteroid belt in conditions that, their medical records later showed, should have resulted in hypoxic damage and hadn't, because her grandmother had been stubborn, and because human bodies were, it turned out, not finished becoming themselves. "I want a full collaborative research partnership," she said, "not visiting researcher status. A genuine partnership, with shared credit, shared access, and a Terran co-authorship seat on any paper that touches this dataset going forward. I want the Category 7 flag removed from my original scan data. And I want an open working group, species integrated, not department siloed, to look at this properly. Because what we're looking at is too big for one department or one institution to study in isolation and arrive at anything close to the truth." The room was quiet. "You're asking us," the council chair said slowly, "to open a full interdisciplinary investigation into the developmental trajectory of your species." "I'm asking you to do science," Mara said, "honestly with me. The way it should have been done from the beginning." One of the unaffiliated representatives, the one who had spoken about the implications of her decision, shifted in her chair. Her dermis layer had gone through 3 color shifts in the last few minutes, which Mara had learned enough to read as a sign of significant internal processing. "The findings in your preprint," this representative said carefully. "If they hold." "They'll hold," Mara said. "The data is clean. I've been working this problem for 7 years." "If they hold," the representative continued, as though she hadn't been interrupted, though without any sign of irritation, which Mara found interesting, "then your species is, there's no neutral way to put this, not where our models placed you on the developmental curve. I know. You're further along. The architecture suggests potential," Mara said carefully, "not certainty. Potential that our environment has been activating for longer than anyone's been paying attention. And you want to study this, together." "I want to study this correctly," she said, "which means together, which means with full transparency. Which means you don't look at my genome without asking me, and I don't run analyses on your data without notifying the relevant parties. Basic science." She looked around the table again. "I'm not asking for anything extraordinary. I'm asking for the thing this institution claims to stand for." Velthorak spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. "Yes," the professor said simply. The council chair turned to look at Velthorak. The professor did not look back. "Yes," Velthorak said again. "She's right. We should have done this correctly from the beginning. We didn't, and that is an institutional failure, and the appropriate response to an institutional failure is not to manage the person who identified it. It's to correct the failure." The professor looked at Mara. "I will sponsor the working group, if the administrative council will authorize it." There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality to it, not hostile, not comfortable, the quality of a situation that has shifted in a direction that several people had not fully anticipated and which cannot be shifted back. The council chair pressed his fingertips together and looked at the table. "We'll need to discuss the parameters." "Of course," Mara said. "I'm available all week." 3 weeks before the working group convened, she had a conversation that she would think about for a long time afterward. It happened in the Commons, over what passed for dinner. The thermally processed complex carbohydrates were particularly good that evening, with a sauce that had taken her a month to learn to request by name. And it happened because a Vethkali she didn't recognize sat down across from her and said, without preamble, that he had read her preprint twice. His name, he offered, was Coordvel. He was a theorist in the Department of Long-Scale Species Studies, which was, he explained when she looked blank, the department that studied civilizational arcs rather than individual species biology. He had silver-gray dermis patterning that indicated a researcher past mid-career, and the particular directness of someone who had spent decades working on problems so large and long-term that social pleasantries had become a kind of tax he had stopped paying. "I want to ask you something that is not, technically, within the scope of your research," he said. "Go ahead," she said. "Your species has been aware of the galactic community for approximately 80 years. Roughly, yes. In that time," he said, "you have established interstellar travel, formal diplomatic presence in 7 clusters, and research contributions across 11 academic disciplines." "We've been busy," she said. Coordvel's facial structures did something that she had not yet learned to read. "In our models," he said, "a newly contacted species at your technological level with your population size and resource constraints would not be expected to achieve sustained interstellar research presence for approximately 600 years. Standard adjustment period. Cultural, technological, biological. The integration takes time." He paused. "Your species has taken 80 years. She ate a bite of her dinner and thought about this. "We're impatient," she said. "That is one interpretation." He leaned forward slightly. "My interpretation is that the 80 years is consistent with the cascade architecture you've described. You are not adapting at a standard rate. You are adapting at a rate that is, Dr. Voss, I want to use the right word here, anomalous." "That's the word I've been using for 7 years, she said. "Yes," he said, "but I don't think you've been using it with the full force it carries. When we say anomalous in my department, we mean something that does not fit the existing model in a way that requires us to revise the model." He looked at her with an intensity that she recognized as the look of a theorist who has found something and cannot let go of it. "In 400,000 years of galactic species contact history, we have never encountered a species whose developmental timeline was this compressed and this nonlinear. We have species that developed quickly. We have species that plateaued. We have species that burned out and species that grew in gradual, predictable curves." He paused. "We have never had a species whose curve looks like this." "What does our curve look like?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "It looks," Coordvel said carefully, "like the beginning of something that our models have never encountered the full shape of." She put down her fork. "The cascade sequences your preprint describes," he said. "In my department's framing, they are not a developmental feature. They are a developmental gear, a thing that changes the ratio between pressure applied and change produced. And what your data shows is that the gear has engaged." He looked at her with complete seriousness. "Dr. Voss, I am not a biologist. I cannot tell you what your species will become. But I can tell you that in 400,000 years, I have never seen a civilizational arc that curved upward this fast. And we detected it, if your preprint is correct, because you are one person who noticed an anomaly in a population health dataset and spent 7 years following it honestly." She sat for a moment with that. "What are you asking me?" she said finally. "I'm not asking you anything," Coordvel said. "I came to tell you that your research matters in ways that extend beyond your department or your discipline. And I came to say," he paused, choosing words with care, "I came to say that in my field, we sometimes encounter moments where a single data point requires us to revise not a model, but a framework. The framework we use to understand how species develop, how civilizations emerge, what the galactic community is, and what it might become." His facial structures did the thing she couldn't read again, and she decided this time that it was something in the register of a very long perspective arriving at a very specific point. "Your data is that kind of point." She went back to her room in Block K that night and sat on the narrow bed and thought about what he had said for a very long time. She was not, she thought, a symbol. She was a researcher with a data set and 7 years of careful work and a fraying duffel bag strap and a green sweater with a hole in the elbow. She was not the embodiment of her species' potential. She was one person who had followed one finding honestly. But she thought about her grandmother. She thought about the asteroid belt and the hypoxia that hadn't happened and the body that had adjusted because it needed to. She thought about the cascade sequences, patient and nested and waiting in the dark of her cells. She thought about what it meant that the gear, as Cordwell had put it, had engaged. She thought we are not what anyone thought we were, including ourselves. Then she thought, good, that means there's still something to find out. She put on the green sweater and made coffee and opened her terminal and started on the working group proposal in earnest. The working group met for the first time 6 weeks later. It had 11 members, from 7 different species, from 4 different institutions. It had the longest institutional name Mara had ever seen on a meeting header, which she immediately shortened in her own notes to the Cascade group. It had her as co-chair, which she suspected had been Velthorak's doing, and which she accepted without ceremony. The first meeting lasted 9 hours. By the 3rd hour, 2 members had asked her questions that required her to go back to the raw data and pull up sequences she'd last looked at 3 years ago. By the 6th hour, a Surrey researcher named Vekorathi, who specialized in dormant genetic expression, had drawn a comparative diagram on the room's display board that made the entire room go quiet for almost 2 minutes, because the diagram showed, with Vekorathi's analysis layered over Mara's data, that the cascade sequences didn't just have the potential for accelerated development. They had already begun expressing, in at least 3 documented population cohorts. In the last 40 years, Mara had known this theoretically. Seeing it on the board, with Vekorathi's cross-species comparative framework making the scale of it visible, was different from knowing it. This expression rate, said one of the Fenrathi members, and both voices were very even, which Mara had come to understand meant something that a human might express by holding their breath, is not within any projectable range. No, Mara said. What is driving the activation? She thought about this. She thought about 40 years of human history. She thought about the things her species had been through, the resource crisis of the 2100s, the early contact period, the Kepler expansion, the 7th-generation adjustment to a galaxy that had existed for billions of years, and had been waiting for humanity the way an enormous, complex, ancient system might wait for a small, unexpected element whose properties it had never had occasion to model. She thought about her grandmother fixing communications arrays in an asteroid belt. She thought about what pressure, applied consistently and in the right directions, could do to a genome that was built to respond. Stress, she said, in the technical sense, novel environmental challenges introduced faster than standard adaptation timelines could accommodate. The architecture activates under pressure. We've been under pressure. The room was quiet again. Vekorathi looked at the diagram. The implication, the Surrey researcher said carefully, is that the more challenging the environment, the more your species is pushed. The faster the architecture expresses, Mara said. Yes. Another long silence. Dr. Voss, Velthorak said from the far end of the table. The professor's 4 arms were in the folded resting position, but there was something in the set of the facial structures that Mara had not seen before, something that she finally identified, after a moment, as something close to awe. How long has your species known about this? We didn't, she said. I found the signature 7 years ago, and I still don't think most of my colleagues believe me. Most humans don't think about our own genetics in these terms. We're too busy adapting to the environment we're in to study the mechanism of the adaptation. You, Vekorathi said, found this in a population health dataset. I wasn't looking for it, Mara said. I was running stress marker analysis. The cascade signatures were just there, in the background, like they'd always been there. She thought about the locked lab. She thought about the Category 7 flag. She thought about what it must look like from the outside, from a species that had had 1,000,000 years to grow comfortable with what it was, to see a dataset like hers. She had spent enough time in enough academic departments to know the difference between a discovery that upset a model and a discovery that collapsed one. For what it's worth, she said, and she said it to the whole room, to all 11 of them, to all 7 species, we're not trying to frighten anyone. We didn't build this architecture on purpose. We don't know we have it. We're just living, doing what we do. She paused. We'd like to understand it too. That's why I'm here. Vekorathi made a sound that the translation system did not render into words, which meant it was a sound that didn't have an equivalent in any known Terran language. Mara made a note of this and decided it was probably not alarm and was possibly something closer to wonder. She filed it the way she filed things, for later consideration. The paper took 14 months to write. There were 43 drafts, which was more than Mara had ever produced for a single piece of work, and she had once written 19 drafts of a methods section for a population genetics paper that ultimately ran 12 pages. There were arguments about statistical frameworks that spanned 6 weeks and 2 conference calls with institutions on the other side of the galactic arm. There was a significant dispute about the implications section that required bringing in a philosopher of science from a Vethkali institution, whose specialty was precisely the question of what it meant to discover that your model of a species was fundamentally wrong. The philosopher spent 2 weeks with the working group, and then wrote a separate commentary piece that was ultimately published alongside the main paper. The main paper ran 112 pages plus appendices. It was published simultaneously across 7 galactic research networks, in 39 translated editions, with full open access. The raw data, all of it Mara's original population health dataset, her personal genomic scan, the access log, the supplementary analyses from every member of the working group, was released in a public archive with documentation thorough enough that any researcher anywhere could replicate any part of the analysis independently. Mara had insisted on the open archive. It had been the last argument, the one that had come closest to ending the collaboration, because 2 of the institutional partners had wanted to maintain some level of controlled access. She understood the reasoning. She had also spent 7 years watching what happened to findings that were managed carefully and incompletely, and she had strong opinions about it. Veltharak had backed her, which had tipped the vote. The title was Latent Accelerated Developmental Architecture in Homo sapiens, Structural Analysis, Expression Patterns and Implications for Human Developmental Trajectory, a multi-species collaborative report. It was the longest titled paper she had ever co-authored. It also, within 72 hours of publication, became the most accessed paper in the history of the Vethkali Grand Academy's research archive. She learned this from Sektorval, who appeared at her workstation in Wing 7, her actual workstation now, in the proper collaborative research space that had been arranged as part of the working group's establishment, with adequate equipment and functional heating on all sides of the processing core, and reported the access numbers with the expression of someone who had spent a significant amount of time reconciling something they thought they knew with something they were still learning. 47 networks accessed your preprint in the first morning, Sektorval said. The final paper has been accessed by 912 distinct institutions in the first 3 days. Okay, Mara said, because she didn't have a better response prepared. Dr. Voss, Sektorval hesitated. The young researcher had the particular quality of a person who has prepared what they want to say and is not certain it will land correctly. I want to ask you something that is, I'm not certain how to phrase it in Terran standard. Try, Mara said. When you submitted the preprint, Sektorval said slowly, you knew what it would do. You knew it would force the situation, make it impossible for anyone to manage the findings quietly. You chose to do that. Yes. And you weren't frightened. Mara thought about her room in Block K. She thought about the locked lab and the 41 names. She thought about the Category 7 flag, and the Fenrathi with the unexplained data chip, and the External Relations Office. She thought about the council meeting, and 9 people in a room, and the specific feeling of being a junior researcher with an inconvenient finding, in a department where inconvenient findings made the senior people nervous. She thought about her grandmother. "I was scared," she said. "I'm usually scared when I do things that matter. That's not a reason not to do them." Sektorville looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the young researcher's expression, a quality of recalibration that Mara had seen in this room before but which was different now, less guarded, more genuine. "The architecture in your genome," Sektorville said. "The cascade sequences, the accelerated development potential." A pause. "Do you think it is expressed in you?" Mara smiled. It was a small smile, the kind she usually saved for moments when she found a clean answer in a messy dataset. "I think 7 years of working on a problem that everyone said was probably wrong and being right might count for something," she said. "But I'm a scientist. I don't make claims I can't support with data." "No," Sektorville said. "You just make them impossible to ignore." The letters started arriving in the second week after publication. Some were academic, collaboration requests, conference invitations, requests to review grant applications, requests to join editorial boards. These came from institutions across 3 galactic arms, and in 2 cases from places that had no formal diplomatic relationship with the Terran Collective, which was its own interesting development. Some were more personal. A Surrey researcher sent a 4-page letter that was, as best Mara could determine, an apology for the access log and a tentative expression of something like gratitude. A Fenrathi she had never met sent a data package, not a chip this time, a properly documented transfer with a note that read simply, "We have been watching your species for 30 years. We thought we knew what we were watching. We did not." Some were stranger than she'd expected. A delegation of junior researchers from a species she'd only encountered in the background of conference calls asked to visit the working group lab and specifically asked to meet her. They arrived on a Thursday and stood in the doorway of the lab and looked at her with an expression that she could not translate and which was, she thought, the specific look of people who have revised something fundamental and haven't quite finished the revision yet. She showed them the workstation. She explained the scan bed and the processing core and the thermal calibration issues, which were still ongoing because Wing 7's facilities maintenance was slow regardless of species. They asked excellent questions. 2 of them were, it emerged over the course of the morning, working on dissertation research in areas that intersected precisely with the cascade architecture analysis. And by noon, she had exchanged contact details and a tentative plan for a collaborative data share. After they left, she sat at her workstation and looked at her hands for a moment. They were the same hands she'd always had. They were unremarkable hands, slightly ink-stained from a pen she'd broken 3 weeks ago and never fully cleaned up, with a small scar on the left thumb from a lab accident in grad school. They had done nothing special. They had held a terminal at 3 in the morning and clicked submit on a document that had been honest about what the data showed. That was all. She thought about what Veltharak had said in the council meeting. "You are not what anyone thought you were." She thought about what that meant for a species that had never, in all its history, had a stable idea of what it was itself. Humans had spent their entire recorded history revising their self-understanding. They had been wrong about their place in the cosmos, their biological origins, their cognitive architecture, their social structures, their limits. They had been wrong about all of these things and had, each time, adjusted. They had argued about the adjustments and fought about the adjustments and sometimes made terrible decisions in the process of adjusting, but they had adjusted. They had kept going. The cascade sequences in her genome had been there the whole time, waiting. watching the pressure, measuring the need. She opened a new document on her terminal and began writing the proposal for the second phase of the research. She called her mother on Sunday, as always. Her mother had seen something about the paper on the news, a brief report on the Terran Collective's public broadcast channel, which had described it as a major xenogenomics finding with implications for human biological research, which was technically accurate, and also the most aggressively understated summary Mara had ever seen. They said it was important, her mother said. It is. They said your name. That's nice. Mara. Her mother's voice had the particular quality that it got when she had been thinking about something for a while and was about to say it. Are you all right? The wall's still closing in. Mara looked out the window of her room in Block K at the luminescent fountain in the plaza and the stars beyond the academy's lights. She had been here for 14 months. She had filed a formal ethics complaint, staged a data release that had restructured her institutional position from margin to center, co-authored a paper that had been accessed by 912 institutions in 3 days, and spent most of it in a worn green sweater eating crackers and drinking terrible coffee at 3 in the morning. She thought about the locked lab. She thought about the Category 7 flag. She thought about what it had felt like to submit the preprint and sit in her room and wait, the specific quality of that fear, the thing her mother had called the other kind of tired. No, she said, and she meant it. They opened up. Her mother made a sound that was fond and skeptical in equal measure, which was the sound that a person made when they had raised someone like Mara and had long since made their peace with the kind of person that produced. Are you eating enough? The pasta equivalent is excellent, Mara said. Good, a pause. Come home when you can. I will, she said. I have some work to finish first. She looked out at the stars. She had not done anything miraculous. She had done what she was trained to do: follow the data, document the process, publish the findings, defend them, and keep going when the walls came up. She had been stubborn, which was a trait her mother had always ascribed to her grandmother's side of the family, and she had been honest, and she had refused to let the institutional management of her findings become the substitute for the findings themselves. The cascade sequences in her genome were already had been expressing in her and in others like her for decades. The environment had applied its pressure, and the architecture had begun to answer. She did not know what her species would become. Nobody did. That was the thing about potential. It was not a promise. It was a capacity. What you made of it was still, always, a matter of what you chose to do on a given morning, or a given Tuesday night at 3 a.m. with a terminal and a green sweater, and a decision to be honest about what the data showed. She closed her terminal and looked out at the fountain a moment longer. The luminescent arcs cycled slowly through the dark. She had not found this view beautiful when she arrived. She found it beautiful now. She thought 14 months, 1 paper, 912 institutions. She thought, we're just getting started. She turned off the light and went to sleep. Vekorathi sent her a message at 4 in the morning, which meant the Surrey researcher had almost certainly been awake all night with the data, which was a thing Mara recognized because she had done it herself several hundred times. The message read, "Third cohort analysis complete. Expression rate in the youngest documented generation is 31% higher than in the oldest. This is not a stable rate. It is accelerating." She read this in the dark of her room in Block K, lying on the narrow bed with her personal terminal held above her face. She typed back, "I know, keep going." Then she put the terminal down and looked at the ceiling. 31% higher, accelerating. What you were made of, it turned out, was not fixed. It had never been fixed. It was something that answered to conditions and time and pressure, something that the universe had placed in human cells like a question it was asking very slowly, over a very long span of time. waiting to see if the answer would come. The answer, she thought, was starting to come. She got up, put on the green sweater, made coffee, and started reading the cohort data.